In the last lecture, we looked at a couple of Epicurean arguments that support the conclusion that death is not intrinsically bad. We saw an argument from Epicurus that effectively asks, if death is so bad, at what time is it bad? Epicurus says, death can't be bad for me while I'm alive because it hasn't happened yet, so there's nothing there for me to experience as bad. And once I'm dead, there's no me around to experience the badness of my death, and so it can't be bad for me then either. And so he concludes, death is neither a misfortune while I'm alive, nor after I'm dead, and for that reason death isn't a misfortune. We also saw the argument from Lucretius, where he argued for a symmetry between post-death and pre-birth. He says, if being dead is such a bad thing, then presumably you must regard the time before your birth as equally terrible. And yet we're not horrified by the endless expanse of non-existence before our births. Why should we be so troubled by the endless expanse of non-existence after our deaths? So these are a couple of arguments that support the claim that death is not intrinsically bad. In this lecture, I want to turn to the contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel, who pushes back against these arguments. He doesn't think that they're valid, and instead presents an argument to say that death, in fact, is intrinsically bad. This is an argument he advances in an article, appropriately enough, called Death. It was first published in the journal Nous, but you can also find it in his collection of essays entitled Mortal Questions. Nagel begins his argument by zeroing in on what exactly might be the problem with death. And he proposes two possibilities. Either you want to say that the state of being dead is intrinsically bad, or you want to say that, in some sense, the deprivation of life that is entailed by being dead is bad. Now, Nagel thinks that the first of these options isn't going to fly. He thinks that it would be hard to build an argument to claim that the state of being dead is a bad one. And he gives three reasons for this. The first is that if being dead were a bad thing, then the longer that you've been dead, the worse it would be. And we don't seem to think that people who died 500 years ago are worse off somehow than the people who died 50 years ago. So that doesn't seem plausible. The second argument he makes is that we don't seem to regard temporary suspensions of life as terrible misfortunes. We haven't yet mastered the art of cryogenics, in which we can put people into suspended animation, but if we could, we wouldn't think that those people who are temporarily suspended in life are in some way suffering a great misfortune. And the third argument he provides is, you might say, an echo of the argument from Lucretius. He says we don't regard it as a terrible misfortune that we didn't exist before we were born. So not existing doesn't seem in itself to be a bad thing. So Nagel accepts the claim that being dead is not bad for a person. But he does want to say that being deprived of life is bad. And what's more, death is a deprivation of life. So to the extent that death is a deprivation of life is intrinsically bad, then death, too, is intrinsically bad. And the basic form of his argument is to say that being alive is a good thing. That in addition to the fact that within our lives some things can go better for us, some things can go worse, the simple fact of being alive is itself a good thing. So Nagel's argument relies on the claim that having a life is intrinsically a good thing. And curiously, he doesn't really muster much of an argument to support this claim. Now, there's three possibilities we could take with regard to the goodness or badness of life. One would be to say that life is intrinsically good, which is the Nagel argument. And in support of this argument, he says that life is worth living even when the bad elements of experience are plentiful, and the good ones too meager to outweigh the bad ones on their own. The additional positive weight is added by experience itself, rather than by any of its contents. So the claim he's making there is that, in some sense, experience itself is positive. Now, here are two other possibilities. You might say that having a life is neither intrinsically good nor intrinsically bad. It's rather circumstantially good or bad. It depends on how your life is going. Some lives are worth living, other lives are not. That would be a second argument that you could present. Or a third claim would be to say that life is intrinsically a bad thing. Now, this is an argument that some philosophers have supported. Most famously, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer has put forward this argument. He claims he derives it from Buddhism, where the first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is suffering. Less clear that the Buddhists themselves would endorse the claim that life is intrinsically bad, but that's maybe a matter for another time. But let me turn to a passage from The Birth of Tragedy, the first book by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, where he was at that time at least significantly influenced by Schopenhauer. And he writes, "There's an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus. When Silenus at last fell into his hands, the king asked, what was the best and most desirable of all things for man? Silenus gave a shrill laugh and broke into these words. What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon." So there, in rather vivid detail, we get a claim that actually being alive is intrinsically bad. Now, I think most of us are probably more inclined toward Nagel's view that having a life is intrinsically a good thing. It is, after all, a rare situation in which somebody chooses to end their own life. And you might say that the fact that for the most part we don't do that suggests that for the most part we endorse the ups and downs of life as intrinsically valuable. But it's worth asking whether Nagel is right there. Like I say, he doesn't provide a very strong argument for this claim. And there are at least two other options available, that life is circumstantially good or bad depending on how it's going, or that life is intrinsically bad. So it may be worth considering that as we consider the validity of Nagel's argument. So this is Nagel's argument in a nutshell. Having a life is intrinsically good. Anything that deprives us of an intrinsic good is intrinsically bad. Death is a deprivation of life, therefore death is intrinsically bad. However, it's not quite so simple as that, and Nagel acknowledges this and responds to several objections. The first is one that we got a glimpse of in the previous lecture when I was discussing the argument from Epicurus. Epicurus, as you'll recall, argues that death can't be a bad thing because there's no point at which I experience its badness. And I noted then that Epicurus' argument relies on the assumption that things can only be bad for us to the extent that we experience their badness. And so for Nagel's argument to go through, he needs to show that we can have things be bad for us even if we aren't experiencing their badness. And he thinks this is the case. And one example he gives is the example of being betrayed by a lover. Suppose my girlfriend is cheating on me behind my back. I don't know about it, and I'm not experiencing this badness. I'm going on with my life cheerfully as before, but those who knew about it would say that I was suffering a misfortune, even though I didn't know it. So that would support the argument that you can have bad things happen to you without experiencing their badness. Now, Nagel acknowledges a possible objection to this counterexample. Perhaps it's not that being betrayed itself that's bad, but rather finding out. When I find out I've been betrayed, I'm crushed and I'm devastated and I'm miserable. And to the extent that I don't know yet, I'm in a bad state because I potentially might find out that there's a danger of me experiencing these bad emotions. But it's only the positive experience of the badness of finding out that is bad about being betrayed. But Nagel thinks this gets the argument back to front. What makes me so upset when I find out I've been betrayed is that I've been betrayed. It's not that the badness of being betrayed is that there's pain attached to finding out. It's rather that finding out is painful because it's bad to be betrayed. Or as Nagel puts it, the natural view is that the discovery of betrayal makes us unhappy because it is bad to be betrayed, not that betrayal is bad because its discovery makes us unhappy. So this is Nagel's argument that things can be bad for us even if we don't positively experience their badness. However, this might not get us all the way to saying that death is a bad thing even though I can't experience it. There is something different, after all, about being betrayed by a partner and being dead, in the sense that even though I'm not necessarily experiencing the badness of being betrayed by a partner, there's still a me who is being betrayed. Whereas when I'm dead, There isn't really a me who is suffering the misfortune of being dead. And so Nagel needs to turn to a second possible objection, that something can't be bad for me unless it happens to me in some important sense. Another way of putting this point is to say that death can only be bad for someone if there's a someone around for whom it's bad. Now, Nagel responds to this objection by providing another example. In this case, he imagines a highly intelligent man who suffers a devastating brain injury that reduces him intellectually to the state of a cheerful infant. That he has very limited intellectual capacities, but emotionally he's well off, so you can't say that he's positively experiencing the misfortune. But nevertheless, Nagel argues, we would want to say that a great misfortune has befallen this person, even though he in some sense is not around to experience its badness. But Nagel says what's happened is that this highly intelligent person has been deprived of many opportunities and many possibilities that awaited him in his ordinary life. Those have been disrupted and taken away from him. And their deprivation is a bad thing for him, even if he's not experiencing the badness, and even though, in some important sense, he is no longer around to experience their badness. And so Nagel says, likewise, death can be bad for me, even if there's no me experiencing the badness, or even a me who is not experiencing the badness. I can be gone, Nagel says, and nevertheless my death is a great misfortune for me. Now, in these arguments, you can see Nagel quarreling with Epicurus, and in a sense, what's at stake here is maybe a deeper question of what it means to have a life. We saw that Epicurus focuses somewhat narrowly on the idea that the goods and bads of life are things that can be experienced by me. If I'm not experiencing them, they don't really count as good or bad for me. Whereas Nagel seems to have a more expansive idea of what constitutes the goods and bads in my life. Things that I'm not experiencing, things that I can't experience, Nagel thinks, are a part of the package that I consider worth having or not worth having. One way of putting the difference between Nagel and Epicurus would be to say that for Epicurus, I, in a sense, can't be wrong about how well my life is going. That it's how my experience of my life is that determines how well or badly my life is going. Whereas for Nagel, there's a whole range of possible ways in which my life can go that can only be assessed from the outside. Whether it's being betrayed by a partner even though I don't know it, or being deprived of things I don't know I'm being deprived of, that might allow for someone on the outside to assess my life as being one that's marked by misfortune. So it's an interesting question there. Who is right? Whether Epicurus is right to think that it's only my own assessment of my own life that counts, or whether Nagel might have a point in saying that there are objective outside perspectives that can trump my own sense of how my life is going. Now let me turn to the third objection that Nagel considers, and this is the one that we saw in Lucretius, where Lucretius argues that the vast period of non-existence before my birth doesn't seem to trouble me much, so symmetrically speaking, the vast period of non-existence after my death shouldn't trouble me either. And as I saw in the lecture on Lucretius, Lucretius's argument relies on a symmetry between the time before my birth and the time after my death. And so I noted there that if we want to object to Lucretius's argument, we need to find some kind of asymmetry between the two, to say that the time after my death is in an important way different from the time before my birth. And Nagel thinks he has an answer there. First of all, I should note that Nagel agrees with Lucretius that this period of non-existence before my birth isn't a deprivation or misfortune. I shouldn't be horrified by it. But he does think that the time after my death is one that should fill me with a kind of dread. And he argues that the difference is that a deprivation can only be a misfortune for someone. That once I've had a life, the deprivation of that life is a misfortune for me. However, the time before my birth isn't a deprivation for me because at that point there is no me to experience the deprivation. If I had been born 50 years earlier, that would have been 50 years worth of time that I could have been alive that I've been deprived of. But, Nagel points out, if I'd been born 50 years ago, or 50 years earlier rather, it wouldn't be me who existed. That would be someone else And so in that sense, it's not me who's deprived of those extra 50 years that I could have had if only I'd been born 50 years earlier. And so Nagel says that there is an asymmetry in Lucretius's argument, and that death is a misfortune because it's a deprivation for me in a way that the time before my birth isn't depriving me of anything at all. Nagel's argument that death is intrinsically bad because death deprives us of the possibilities of life leaves us with a further question. Presumably, the more life we're deprived of, the greater the misfortune is our death. And there's some intuitive sense in that. The poet John Keats died at the age of 25. The novelist Leo Tolstoy died at the age of 82. And there's a tendency, I think, that seems somewhat natural to suppose that Keats suffered a greater misfortune in dying at 25 than Tolstoy did in dying at 82. That Keats was deprived of more life, of more possibilities, and we, the rest of the world, were deprived of more great poetry. But if dying at 82 is not as bad as dying at 25, and what's more, at least so far, the human lifespan is naturally limited, does that mean that there's a certain point at which our death ceases to be a misfortune? Maybe it was too bad that Tolstoy died at 82. He could have had another 5 good years left in him. But if somebody dies at the ripe old age of 110, are they being deprived of something? Is there a point at which death no longer counts as a deprivation? Nagel says no. And his point isn't that life could and should be extended indefinitely, but rather that at any given point at which a life ends, there was potential for there to be more life. That there's no definite limit. That in a sense you could say that the finitude of human life is in some sense open-ended. There's no point at which we hit the absolute limit. And so as long as there is the possibility open for more life, and as long as that life is intrinsically good, death, whenever it comes, says Nagel, is intrinsically bad, even if its badness is worse the more that we're deprived of. So that wraps up my presentation of Nagel's argument. I think there's a lot to grapple with there. There are some really interesting replies to some of the arguments we saw in the previous lecture, but I think there are also some questions that we're left with. In the next lecture, I'm going to turn to Bernard Williams, who, like Nagel, offers an argument for the intrinsic goodness of life and hence the intrinsic badness of life. But he adds a bitter twist that connects to this point I made at the end here. Namely, that Williams thinks that extending life indefinitely progressively reduces the value of life. And it really is possible to have too much life, even if, at any point, losing it is intrinsically bad.